Rockville is known as a city of neighborhoods, and one that reveres its roots. We had the opportunity to meet with 4 experts on some of Rockville's modern planned neighborhoods. Using historian Teresa Lachin's book, Rockville's Recent Past, as a blueprint, the Rockville 11 team offers a closer look at the city's neighborhoods from the mid-20th century to today, or otherwise known as Rockville's Recent Past. We begin our tour with the neighborhood of Twinbrook. This single-family residential area was developed in the 1940s and 1950s and experienced tremendous growth in the years that followed World War II.
Well, Twinbrook is sometimes called the quintessential American suburb. That's sort of its unofficial nickname, if you will. And it was the work of Joseph Gerhardt, who immigrated from Belgium and was a developer in Montgomery County, and then acquired land in the area we now know as Twinbrook. He named that because of the 2 streams which bisect the area, and started building houses in the late 40s through the 1960s. He built in several stages, and the homes started out as relatively small by our standards and became more sophisticated and with more amenities, and I think the kitchens were updated. But the basic premise was to give people a home that was a starter home. The streets were named after battles, famous military battles of World War II and I think World War I as well, to appeal to patriotic-minded buyers or veterans returning looking to settle down with wives and have families. And these were considered starter homes. You could either live in them a while and sell and move up, if you will, or you could expand. You could add a top floor or build out the back. They were meant to be homes that offered a lot of versatility for young families. Pretty soon schools were built in the area, and they built the Twinbrook Shopping Center. That was another of Gerhardt's projects. Gerhardt was very far-sighted in terms of wanting to help build a community. Not all developers after the Second World War were interested, they were more motivated by profit, but Gerhardt seems to have been committed to the neighborhood and to the well-being of the community and seeing it grow and prosper.
Elevations and over 15 different color combinations give this new community of Twinbrook Forest a distinction all of its own.
I think you can go through, you can drive through Twinbrook and find houses that seem relatively unaltered. We've been able to identify any number of those. But then there are homes also that have been remodeled on the exterior. Some have, instead of the 50s modern look, they now have colonial, they have colonial facades, dormers and things that you wouldn't have found on the Twinbrook homes. And in a way, it's a great place to go and study public taste in housing styles, the ways in which people have modified a home to suit their own tastes. And that makes it a very interesting and versatile neighborhood.
Woodley Gardens is located in the north-central section of the city, east of I-270. Much of the neighborhood is a mix of single-family homes and townhouse units that were built in the 1960s.
Well, it's typical red brick colonial-style homes that are in a wooded area and has a very strong community feel in the neighborhood. It's near I-270, so it has easy access to get around. It's also near the metro, but it has a neighborhood feel to it that you have a little shopping area there, you've got a park, you used to have a school, it now has a senior center, and it's a neighborhood that a lot of people have grown up in and then come back and live, or else their parents stay living there and so they come and visit their parents.
The neighborhood was created in part from a change in the county's zoning law.
Well, back in the early 1960s, Montgomery County made a new designation for zoning that allowed the the developers to come in and do a pre-planned community as opposed to doing individual sites. And so Woodley Gardens is the very first community that was built using this new designation. Monroe Warren, both senior and junior, it's a father-son team, came in and they set aside land for single-family homes, for townhomes, for apartments. They set aside land for a park, for a little shopping center, and also for the elementary school.
Woodley Gardens offered a neighborhood with new features to potential homeowners.
He advertised it as being a country club community, and this was in some ways to recognize the fact that it was a pre-planned community because he fully intended to have a pool, so the country club atmosphere. But he also wanted to counter views about Rockville at the time, which was considered part of the boonies, the sticks, a working class neighborhood. And he wanted to upgrade that image by building in Rockville a kind of a traditional architectural design, but using a modern zoning designation to make it a community feel to it.
Architecturally speaking, the original integrity of the neighborhood has stayed the same over the years, offering a glimpse into the style of homes from the 1960s.
I think the biggest change has been that the elementary school was closed in 1979, and that became the senior center in 1982. The building was renovated. It's been renovated several times since then, and it's become really a mecca for our senior citizens in the city to come to. The one other strange aspect of our neighborhood, I would say, is that we have a few modern houses, and people see those on Nelson Street. Those were built in the 1970s, and there's a couple actually modern houses that are right in the neighborhood itself. And those are by a different builder than Monroe Warren, and when they were first built, people were like, oh my goodness, these are so different looking, how could they fit in with the neighborhood? But with time, because of the trees growing up around them and things, and our own sensibilities changing, I think that they've just fit right into the neighborhood, and we're all talking among each other, and we're all having a lot of fun in the neighborhood and enjoying the fact that we have a great place to live.
Numark Commons is a quiet neighborhood located near I-270 Town Center and the Rockville Metro Station. It was incorporated in 1967 and has a mix of single-family units and townhomes. University of Maryland Associate Professor of Architecture Isabel Grenay is an expert on Numark Commons. She shared her thoughts on some of the unique features of this neighborhood.
I would describe it as a late modern subdivision which tries to mix densities and preserve nature. There was a lake dug by hand, and the Numark Lake is kind of a successor to a long tradition of ornamental lakes around which houses would be built. So that was one really interesting feature. The other one was the entrance. You don't see houses, but you see a kind of pylon which looks like a totem, very interesting in wood, and which is kind of a symbol of Numark.
Numark Commons was designed to be a new mark upon the landscape, as one of the first planned unit developments to be approved under an ordinance adopted by the city in 1964. Numark Esplanade, the main thoroughfare, was the only street in the community designed for through traffic. The original street plan called for 3 access points to the project.
And they were able to get Numark Esplanade, the main street, to be closed on one side. So it became a dead-ending street, and it was not viable anymore to get that little shopping center. That's really an issue which, if you want to embed in the middle of a community this type of amenity, it's not so easy. It's a little better usually to put it a little bit on the side where it's easily accessible from outsiders, and still people who live in the neighborhood can walk to it.
Open space is one of Numark's primary amenities. About 15.6% of the total site is open space, including the 4.5-acre lake and the pedestrian walkway system.
It was to keep as many mature trees as possible, and that was something he would always do, a tree survey. So any tree which was more than, I think, 12 inches in diameter were marked and would not be removed unless, you had to. And he wanted to, he kept the underbrush. And it's wonderful to walk in Numark. You've got all kinds of smaller, formal or informal ways to go through the neighborhood.
Located in downtown Rockville, the Americana Center gives residents a unique perspective of the city. Built in the late 60s, the garden-style apartments offer a community experience in the midst of city living. Teresa Lachin gives more insight on the features of this neighborhood.
Americana Center is a multifamily residential, actually a community. Most people think of apartment buildings as sort of impersonal, but it is a community in every sense of the word. Was part of urban renewal, was built as part of the mid-city urban renewal for the 1960s and early 70s. And it's sort of right out there at the intersection of Jefferson Street and Hungerford Drive, Rockville Pike. It's also kind of secluded because it's sheltered by the streets and it focuses inward on itself. But it is in every sense of the word, a neighborhood like other Rockville neighborhoods. It was developed, planned and developed by Carl M. Freeman Associates. Freeman is well known in this area as a pioneer in multifamily housing and garden apartments. And this was a project that came relatively late in his career. He had a number of projects in Virginia and Montgomery County and throughout the metropolitan area, and won numerous awards for his work, for his design work. Once Metro came through, it became a really convenient place to live. But in the 70s, it was also convenient to public transportation up and down Rockville Pike and throughout Rockville. And as part of urban renewal, it was a residential component of a much bigger project that modernized the downtown area, that reconfigured the streets from a rather old town street grid to a modern configuration of street patterns. And it was also touted as being convenient to shopping in much the same way that the Noontown Center affords the same sort of, and to decrease the need for auto dependency. And we've looked at photographs from the 70s and 80s, and the architectural character of the buildings, it's been beautifully maintained, for one thing. And the architectural character is basically unaltered, which is a good thing. It's very much of it still looks very much like the 70s modernism. The most recent changes have been improvements to what they call the plaza deck, which is a commons area in the center of the Americana complex. It's a recreation, public use space. And it was originally planned a couple of years ago to address problems in the water problems in the parking garage. But they replaced the entire deck, and they installed new landscapes and planters and light fixtures, and they made the commons area much less austere and more inviting and more welcoming. It has softer edges, a lot more planting, and I think now it does indeed evoke the ideals of a so-called garden apartment, because there are mature trees and perennials, annuals, flower beds and the like, in addition to benches, tables. It's a much more inviting space than it was when Carl Freeman designed it. It's less austere, and people there seem to like to make use of it.
Drive by King Farm on Route 355 and you'll notice some of the signs of its former life as a working farm. The 440-acre area was annexed to the city in 1995 and was developed as a comprehensive planned community. Rockville Chief of Planning Jim Wasilak has seen the progress of King Farm and shared his thoughts on what makes King Farm different.
I would describe it as a neo-traditional neighborhood. It was kind of a planning theme that emerged late 80s, early 90s. Now, going back to how development patterns were maybe 100 years ago, and when single-family homes really came to prominence, they really were closer together, closer to the street, had front porches, and it was a little more pedestrian-friendly, mainly because the influence of the automobile hadn't taken place yet. So there was a thought that we needed to go back to that due to some of the real or perceived ills of regular suburban development. I think it's been an addition to kind of the examples of new urbanism or neo-traditional development that have occurred around the country. In this region, the Kentlands in Gaithersburg is probably kind of the leading example. And this is just kind of added to that. I'm not sure anyone's kind of used King Farm as a model, but it's certainly been a model of success.
Thought of today as a thriving multimodal community, King Farm is deemed a success for many reasons.
I think it has been, and I don't say that, I guess I could say that from a planning perspective, but just from a livability perspective, everyone that I know that lives in King Farm seems to really love it. And when you go there, it just seems almost kind of ideal. There's families in the parks and walking on the streets and on their porches. And that was what was really intended with the development, to bring people out of their homes.
Rockville's tapestry of neighborhoods make up the fabric of the city's story. As the city continues to grow, these neighborhoods will serve as a record of Rockville's recent past.
Over the course of 5 lectures this spring, we've seen the maturation of the American dream, the evolving vision of American community and family life over the past 7 decades. In Twinbrook, we see a post-war ideal, a simple, elegant reaction to the messy, crowded, heterogeneous perception of the urban center, and an assertion of the independence of the nuclear family through its neighborhoods of small family, single-family houses. At Woodley Gardens, greater density allowed for greater amenities, refining the planning concept and the architectural expression we saw at Twinbrook. At Numark Commons and Americana Center, this suburban formula was molded into distinctive verdant landscapes and the economic and architectural variation. In its innovative, walkable, dense design, at King Farm we seem to see a great effort to create something new, a community that includes the best of the city and the suburb. Is this a continuing refinement on the ideals of Twinbrook, or the statement of new principles? And is it too early to tell? Does King Farm suggest future directions? So we conveniently had a 15-minute summary that sort of brought everything up, but I thought I would start with that. I have some prepared questions, things I thought that came to mind after looking at reading your information. I think one thing I'd like to start with is all 5 communities are really innovative examples of residential design. And why did these developers select Rockville? And is there something that makes this town distinct? I think that each of our lecturers spoke about singly why the developer selected that area. But is there something about Rockville that has consistently attracted innovative residential design?
Well, I can start with Twinbrook, which was way out from Washington in the late 1940s, the mid-1940s, when it was purchased. And Joseph Gerhardt seems to have been the ringleader behind doing that and getting 3 cohorts to join him in a partnership that was very loose and didn't last very long. But the initial acreage was purchased, and it went from there over a period of close to 15 years. But the idea of doing that was to keep housing prices low, pure and simple. The land was less expensive, and he thought he could build a better mousetrap for a lower price, and marketed houses that way, and was very successful doing it. He would later recalled that he was dubbed the Fool of Rockville when he bought the company bought the acreage initially, but he proved him wrong. That's a very risky thing to do in real estate development. He went on to do it in the 1960s in Loudoun County, not far from Dulles Airport, and that development went bust. It was still too far out and not readily accessible, and he had some major competitors who soaked up what market did exist. So it goes to show you when you're pioneering location, it's not it's by no means a done deal. From a survey that the Twinbrook Elementary School students did in the, I think, 54 or so, the great majority of breadwinners living in Twinbrook worked in Washington or very close to it. So it really, Rockville was not a major employment center, and nor was the what's now the I-70 corridor or whatever. The great majority of employment opportunities were in the city of Washington. So it was a fair commute, although probably a lot easier than it is today with a lot less traffic.
Well, I guess I'd also like to cite the fact that during the post-war era, there was a movement to decentralize some of federal government agencies. National Bureau of Standards, today NIST, relocated in the 60s, the Atomic Energy Commission, and on the tail of coattails of that came consulting firms, tech, what we know as high-tech firms, Fairchild, and so forth. So that brought employment to the area and made it possible for real estate development to open up. I think it was an incentive to create housing for people who were either working or thinking about, moving out to this area. Also important, I think, and 3 of the sites that we've discussed in this series, Woodley Gardens, Twinbrook, and of course King Farm, were on former agricultural tracts. And that land, at least not King Farm certainly, but the land in the post-war era was relatively inexpensive, and people were ready to sell. So I think those are factors. And the fact that Rockville is the county seat and is, in that sense, a potential magnet for development because by virtue of that, the distinction. So.
Well, fast forwarding to the 90s, the King Farm property, it was a contiguous property, 430 acres, well positioned within the county and the region, adjacent to the transportation infrastructure that had grown up around it and everything else that had developed. So I think there was an opportunity from that perspective. A developer with good financial backing, like the one that ultimately did the project, saw that as very attractive. The city was certainly very supportive of bringing the property into Rockville because the King Farm property was not in the city at the time. It had to be annexed into Rockville. But our development processes and our ability to issue permits quickly, I think, gave the city an advantage over working with Montgomery County generally. So I know from the development perspective that was attractive to them. And I think the city was very supportive of the type of development that this developer wanted to do at King Farm. There were a lot of rumors as to what might happen on this property that were not viewed as desirable by the city. So the city was able to kind of partner with the developer to some degree and achieve something that was desirable for the city as well as for the developer and those who might wanted to come live here.
What was the city not looking for at King Farm?
As I understand it, that was a little bit before my time with the city, that there were developers who wanted to do big box retail, which was very hot at the time, and certainly along the 355 corridor, probably not unexpected that developers might want to do that. Office Park, in the late 80s was certainly something that was in the realm of possibility. And so I think there was a lot of concern about vehicular traffic and not impacting existing neighborhoods in Rockville. So it was felt that something that was more mixed use and more residential would kind of diffuse the traffic impact of such a large parcel and a development coming online at one time.
Do we have any idea how the city of Rockville felt about Twinbrook?
It depends on who the individuals were, I think. First of all, again, Twinbrook was not in the city limits. There was a legislation afloat to increase Rockville's acreage by a very large amount in the late 40s, and sort of piggybacking on that, Gerhardt was successful in enlarging that landmass even greater, to include most of Twinbrook, and then several years after that came back for Twinbrook Forest to include it. And the reason why was to get city services, thinking that Montgomery County is a very big and sort of amorphous thing, and much more could happen, and there would be much more accountability within the city of Rockville itself. And so I think it was welcomed, but then Twinbrook was sort of one of the leading areas of the city to stage something of a political revolution and vote in a whole new slate of local officials, with the first mayor of this reform government being a resident of Twinbrook. So I'm sure there's some people of the old guard who were not terribly pleased about that, or perhaps about the changes from being a small and really a very rural community into being something that was more conspicuously part of a greater metropolitan area.
I don't know.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I received some instructions on that. Sorry.
Can you hear me? I'm curious about the aspect of the commercial component. Isabel Gournay had said for Numark Commons that Ed Bennett kind of missed his chance because he had that as a second phase, and once the people were already living there, they were opposed to commercial, and so the commercial didn't end up getting built up in Twinbrook. Earhart had a shopping center. Was that part of the original plan, and did he have trouble in getting his commercial in as part of the community?
No, not at all. And it was ideally situated because it was on the community was on both sides of it, but it was also along a major thoroughfare, so it could easily draw traffic from a much wider market area. Excuse me. He was intending it to be really a mecca for retailing, but he had no experience in this whatsoever. If a property wasn't nearly large enough for that sort of thing, and he got trounced by Congressional Plaza within a couple of years of the Twinbrook Shopping Center opened. There's a much larger facility within easy driving distance. So the Twinbrook Center becomes sort of a convenience center that way, well situated in the abstract, but not when there's competition that can supply with more. With Numark Commons, the problem there, and it's interesting that it was planned in the center of a community, in the physical center of a community, so late because there had been a number of other cases in various parts of the country where this idea is you're creating a whole community, and therefore you put the retail center in the middle of that, but then you're really limiting your market to the occupants of that community rather than to a larger one. So that it was among people who were into retail development, certainly by I think the late 1950s, early 1960s, it was seen as an ill-advised way of doing it. And really, for the most part, unless, again, it's just like Woodley Gardens, a little, tiny 3 or 4 stores. If you're doing anything bigger, it really, you really have to have a huge underserved market that you're creating in part by your own development. But getting into retail for a community gets to complicate the situation. Well, not originally. Greenbelt was tiny, and but it was really remote when it was built in the 30s, and so it was done. That was a very idealistic plan, and it worked because of its remoteness, but also because of the idea of this as a cooperative community and with cooperative stores. So a lot of residents became invested in those stores early on. Later, by the by the 1980s, much later, it had lost its draw almost completely. It's been revitalized and changed somewhat, but the idea of that's where you go to get your groceries, or to have a dry cleaning done or whatever, that sort of thing disappeared long, long ago.
The Greenbelt Theater is up for currently the Partners for Preservation program is having voting, and it's one of the things you can vote for to improve. They need some maintenance funds, so you can go online and vote for Greenbelt Theater. Yeah. Well, we talked a little about sort of the idea of commercial, or to discuss it more broadly, sort of centralized amenities, and what was the role of those in each of these communities. And Woodley Gardens, I know the speaker isn't here, but can anybody speak sort of to the influence of the retail or the sort of community amenities at Woodley Gardens?
Well, I think one, I can't really tell you a lot about it, but one of the, during the question and answer session for that series, one resident mentioned that when Safeway wanted to put beer and wine sales in the store, the community said no, and so they left. So it suggests that the community had some very strong ideas about what they did and did not want to see in their shopping center. It's visible from what was then 70S, today 270, and so it has a kind of built-in commercial viability by virtue of that. It's also sort of in the front end of the neighborhood. It's not in the center, so it's visible and it's more or less strategically located. So I think that's helped to underwrite some of its commercial viability. But Safeway, according to this resident, left because of that. I haven't any other documentation. I think one of the interests, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend all 5 lectures, and my own too, duh. But I think one of the themes that emerges from it is that relationship, even the tension between the residential and the commercial or the retail, and what kind of a configuration, how that figures into the plan, where it's located, its viability, its short-term and long-term viability. I think it was one of the more interesting themes to emerge from this series, and one that I kind of like to keep looking at that. In terms of Americana Center, the Rockville Mall, of course, was a big selling point, but so was White Flint Mall, which is also on the chopping block, too, if I'm not mistaken. So the retail was one of the strongest selling points in newspaper advertisements that I looked at.
So Woodley Gardens was billed as this country club community because it had a swimming pool and some other sort of communal amenities. Did anybody else try to have those? Does anybody else have those?
Twinbrook did. I think there was a volunteer effort to get a swimming pool built. Isn't that right?
One of the major differences in post-war development is that the idea of a comprehensively planned, quote, total residential community was an idea actually begun in the 19th century, but it wasn't until the 1920s that this idea really caught on, and that's because of widespread dependence upon the automobile, and it was for upper-end residential development. J.C. Nichols of Kansas City was sort of a dean of this school of real estate planning, so upper middle class and whatever enclaves in various parts of the country were done that way. Chevy Chase is an example, begun earlier, but really mostly realized in the first 30 years or so of the 20th century. Applying that to a broader middle class or even moderate income market was for the most part a post-World War II idea. It had happened earlier with company towns, where there was a captive audience, and in order to keep the workers from striking or whatever, they were sometimes provided with amenities in the so-called model company towns, but in a very paternalistic way, just as with all other aspects of life in those towns. Generally, for sort of mainstream residential real estate development, most land was platted, that is, laid out, and then lots were sold and people built. And it was up to the municipality or whatever to provide space for any kind of public recreation grounds and so forth. So when somebody like Gerhardt comes along in the in the mid-1940s and is talking about a total community, he's not the first person to do it, or even the first person to do it targeting to a mass market in the post-war era, but he's on the cusp of that. It's very very early, and he seems to have been experimenting like everybody else. And what do these amenities mean? Open space is key. Land for schools is key. Land for houses of worship is key to that, depending upon the location, the size of a community. And you have to be building a fairly large community in order to provide very much of this. Otherwise, there simply isn't the capital available to do it. But the idea becomes more and more of a standard thing for middle-income households, and Numark Commons is unusually generous in terms of the amount of open space that it provides, and the wooded quality and the like. And there's certainly precedents for that in Montgomery County and in Fairfax County and the like, but not too many. And Woodley Gardens is likewise, although it looks very different, still has and is much more traditional in its site design as well as in its buildings, but still having a swimming pool, a large recreation area, and the like. This becomes a major way to attract buyers in an increasingly competitive market. The baby boomers or the post-war generation, pre-baby boomer, but the post-war generation that forms a market for all of this by the late 50s is getting more affluent. Family size is getting larger. There are kids. Recreation is very important for that. So it becomes a major marketing tool. And I'll turn it over to you about King Farm.
Now, following on that same theme, I mean, by the time King Farm was coming along, there was an expectation that there would be an amenities package associated with the development of that size and of kind of that price point. There was going to be a homeowners association that would be running the amenities and managing the commonly owned land areas. So, that was a little bit of a different type of development that had started immediately post-war. I will say about the commercial village center, one thing that, for better or for worse, the land use and the amount of development for the parcel was actually set by Montgomery County in their Shady Grove master plan. So there wasn't a lot of variability that was possible, and so the developer built to what the master plan said, because from Maryland annexation law, they really couldn't deviate unless the county council gave them special approval, and they probably didn't want to go through that process. So they built the village center in the center, kind of embedded within the development. I guess there are probably varying reactions to how successful that's been and whether it's been successful from a design perspective. But it really was intended to be a neighborhood center, grocery store anchored, that served the 3,200 residential units that were approved in King Farm. And I think there was a feeling that it would be viable from that perspective. I think if you asked the developer if they had their wish, probably would be on 355 or Shady Grove Road with that frontage that came along with that. So, but the private amenity package that the homeowners association provides, and certainly the public amenities, Stream Valley Parks and the two park school sites that were dedicated by the developer of the city were all part of that package and the expectation, and really, I think, contribute to the quality of life in the community.
And certainly drove the design in many ways.
Absolutely.
As developments, each of these communities was marketed and sold, even to renters, often with innovative advertising. How did the marketing approaches vary between these communities, and what does this say about the evolving ideal? So what do we know about how Twinbrook was advertised? You know, it was a Veterans Administration, post-war. Did we see advertising? What happened?
Yeah. Newspaper advertising is always key, and as some of us remember, the Washington Post used to have a big fat real estate section every Saturday, and the Evening Star had one as well. Far more coverage of what was going on in residential development, but in other things as well than you can find in the paper today, and that had a very wide readership. So crucial, and the Washington Post would have a home show. There was a Washington home show every year, and the Post would publish maps showing where all these developments were, and there was a lot of sort of coordinating of ballyhoo amongst the developers. Gerhardt got more flamboyant in later years and had the Twinbrook twins all suited up, and I believe they flew planes as well and would go to air shows and other things too. I'm not sure how much all of us actually sold houses, but for Twinbrook Forest, by that point he had assumed the mode of not just building houses and hoping they would sell, but selling houses before they were built, something that the Levitts had used extensively and to great effect even before World War II. So if you were willing, if you signed on the dotted line for your property and your house to be built, he would take you up in a helicopter, or one of his staff would, so you could see your lot relative to the whole community. Again, I'm not sure how many lots were sold that way, but he was written up a lot in the area's builders' house organ in terms of his flamboyant style. He had Hopalong Cassidy. He had his friend Hubert Humphrey dedicate the shopping center, and Hubert Humphrey had bought one of his houses in Copeland Terrace, which is in the northeastern corner of Chevy Chase, and they were neighbors and they became friends, and so he was then just maybe not even just a member of the House, I think, at that point. But still, it was a big deal. So lots of ballyhoo.
The clip that we saw had aerial video of Twinbrook and footage and the streetscape. Are those from commercials from the day?
It looks like it was home movies. Somebody was holding the camera.
Well, there also was a voiceover at one point that sounded like, come to Twinbrook, it's a wonderful place. I wondered if it was.
I don't know what that's. I don't know what's that from. Mary may be able to answer that better than I.
That's from the family. His son gave it to us, and so I believe it's something that they had put together themselves, and I'm not quite sure if it was ever aired, for example.
But television advertising in the 50s was a lot more down home, if you will, than it is now.
I know a little bit about how Numark was advertised. Well, I'll start with Woodley Gardens. The ads that I've seen, and I haven't seen many, but they may be representative, were more buttoned down. There was an emphasis on the country club atmosphere. They were very tailored and trim, and there was a kind of elegance to them, I guess in keeping with the image that the Warrens were trying to project for the community. And there was something sort of sedate, suggesting, you know, that this was a community of refinement for a lot of people who were buying up into the market. Numark, on the other hand, the ad that I remember most clearly was actually a very big spread in the, I want to say the Sentinel. I believe that's the source, but we have it at Peerless. I hope my memory is correct there, Claire. And it was an extensive reporting on virtually every aspect of the community. I don't know who did the research or the writing, but it was very extensive. Anything and everything, probably many things you didn't really care to know in buying a house, you could find out. And I think it suggests that the demographic and the people I've talked to in Numark bear this out for me. The demographic was, you know, educated, professional, and we had friends who lived there at one time, college professors, GW. I mean, this is a prospective buyer, and the ads were sort of geared to that. Americana Center had a series of ads. One is more or less informative. The first that I saw from '72 is informative. It's the general information. The second ad that I remember clearly is really not an image at all of Americana Center, but of two people standing on a balcony looking at the view down Rockville Pike, presumably, and gazing perhaps also into their future, suggesting that they're on their way up. They bought into the market. Their lives are just beginning. They have their future ahead. I mean, it's really a horizon-bound kind of gaze out into the landscape, the view below from on their way up. And then another ad from Americana Center is very much geared towards the towers. It's a kind of a cartoon ad, emphasizing the idea that White Flint's just a hop down the pike, and Americana Center is, quote, just minutes away from everywhere important. So the appeals are really very, in my view, very geared towards the product and become increasingly sophisticated. I guess Jim can talk about King Farm.
I think there were probably two keys to King Farm. One is kind of the branding of the development. They had an image that they wanted to project, and certainly it was a different kind of community than most others that were out there in the marketplace. So I think they were able to capitalize on that. I remember some of the ads. They did the traditional ads in the Post and marketing brochures, etc. So there was that aspect to it, but there was also kind of hitting the mark at the same time the internet really got big. So they were able to advertise on the web very successfully. And I recall kind of in the midst of the building frenzy that lasted from about 97 to 04, that most of the majority of people that were moving into King Farm were coming from outside the region. So I think their marketing was really, on the internet, was really effective from that perspective. It was less people moving into King Farm from other parts of the city and county in this region, but people moving from other parts of the country. Certainly the region was generating a lot of jobs at the time. And you know, when you're out there looking for a place to live and your new job, King Farm, I think, popped up.
I wanted to ask about the architecture. Twinbrook had a certain modern look, which I don't think has held up very well. And it was bought into by developments that occurred subsequently, like Hungerford has a lot of the same style houses with roofs of contrasting pitches, yet phony shutters tacked onto the contemporary windows. Numark came late in the 60s, very late, and the developer found that he could not sell those houses throughout the whole project and sold off some of the land. Now that, the first house I owned was out on the edge, miles beyond Rockville, sort of south of Overley, built by Alfondre. The houses were of contemporary style, mimicking, to some extent, what Ed Bennett was doing in Numark and had previously done in Carderock Springs, but without the same quality. Yet that developer also gave up on the contemporary houses halfway through his subdivision, and the rest were, you know, the usual. So part of my question is, what was going on in terms of, I guess, architectural style? What happened? I mean, clearly, at one time, there seemed to be a market, and then the market seemed to have faded. And also, you know, curious about whether or not the developments, let's say Twinbrook, Hungerford, which mimicked that same, I think, rather odd mix of contemporary design of an odd nature with traditional motifs like, you know, tacked on shutters. What has that done to the marketability of those neighborhoods? You know, what has endured here?
A very good question, interesting question, and one that doesn't demands more of a quick answer. Joseph Gearhart designed the houses in Twinbrook, probably all of them. We're not sure about the first ones, which were, quote, Cape Cod houses, and the standard sort of design that the Federal Housing Administration was saying this is what you should do if you want to, you know, get your mortgage insured. But then he broke and into things that were more, quote, modern, and that was taken directly from Levittown, Long Island, which he visited, and both the planning in space-wise and internally, and the image, and the idea that you could finish off the quote attic story as well. So you're buying the house for less, and then as you, or with your own elbow grease or whatever, you can complete it. And that was very popular, but in the early 50s, and there were many developers who patterned their houses after those of Levittown, Long Island, and Levittown, Pennsylvania. Afterwards, by the time Levittown, Pennsylvania was winding down in the late 50s, already, well, you can sort of look, because Levitt had annual models, just like automobiles at that point. He was, I think, one of the perpetrators of this idea, and each year they get a little more traditional in one aspect or another, and finally by the end of it there's a whole very few streets which have much more traditional looking houses. He had commissioned for the third Levittown in Willingboro, New Jersey. He had commissioned one of the great modern architects of the world at that point, Richard Longstreth, to do some preliminary schemes, and I think dropped him like a hot potato when you know, out of fear that nobody was going to buy those. The market, as it was getting more affluent, was also getting more conservative in its taste, so that by the late 50s, a lot of mass market housing looks more traditional than it did at the beginning of the decade. So that's sort of a gradual but very decisive shift. Twinbrook is interesting because Gearhart, after sort of dropping the Levitt model in the mid-50s for Twinbrook Forest, he does this, that, and the other thing. He does about 13 different models, and is experimenting in why he did so many and so varied and whatnot. We can only speculate. on, and that's some of those that you're thinking about in terms of Hungerford, where he seems to have let one of his former associates use his own design. Either that, or maybe he sold the rights to the design. I'm not sure. And a lot of people think it's Gerhard. It's not, and I'm losing track of his former associate's name at the moment. Now, Numark Commons is responding, which is later, but is responding to a somewhat different market because the Washington metropolitan area has, if you will, a tradition now, you can say, of modern subdivision tracts, Holland Hills and near Mount Vernon being one of the most famous of those, but there were a number of others, and several in Montgomery County that you mentioned, and a lot of that was attracting people who were from out of town, who were moving to the area, who were from the Southwest, from the West Coast, where that kind of work was much more appreciated. But even then, it was a limited market, and Washington was by and large a fairly conservative region for tastes in housing. So it's no surprise, or one shouldn't be surprised, I should say, that Bennett couldn't pursue this idea further. The same thing happened to Reston, where the initial designs, which were very cutting edge, where it was so slow taking off that finally the major investor, Gulf Oil, took over the project and started doing houses of a very traditional bent.
I think, Jim, do you have any response to this question?
I do. King Farm is, it's a neo-traditional community, so it has a traditional design aesthetic in its land planning and its architecture, and that was all by design. Probably what was built there probably has had more review than anything else that's ever been built in Rockville, namely because there were very extensive design guidelines that were approved before at the same time the development was approved. There were very extensive design guidelines that talked about the design aesthetic for each kind of development that was going to be built. So kind of knew what was going to happen on the site, which is a good thing. Another thing that was different with King Farm is they had their own town architect that would review all of the plans before it was actually submitted to the city for approval. So those guidelines were in place. They had review kind of on their side before it was submitted to us, and of course we reviewed them again, and then the Planning Commission reviewed them and approved them. So there's an extensive amount of review to ensure that there was a consistency of design across the different types of structures, many different builders that built in the King Farm. They all had to work from the same palette. So it was a very traditional one in keeping with the land planning. Not to say that it couldn't have been. I visited a subdivision outside Denver that was a traditional town plan, but had very modern architecture. So it can work in a different way. But this was clearly the design aesthetic that they wanted to achieve.
Let me just add to that, the King Farm is a manifestation of what's generally referred to as a new urbanism, and its founders included a husband-wife team of architects based in Miami under Strani and Elizabeth Platter-Zodberg, the latter of whom is on the Commission of Fine Arts in Washington. And their idea, I spoke at the second, I think it was, conference of the new urbanism which was in Alexandria, and the idea was that a lot of the premises for quote suburban planning or residential planning outside the city center were fundamentally flawed, and you needed to go back and look at places such as Georgetown and Alexandria and Charleston and New Orleans and so forth, and not just for image, but in terms of planning, in terms of layout. And a lot of this is also a reaction to the fact that you have to get in the automobile to do almost anything in a, quote, traditional suburban community. so that communities could be walkable again. Walk to school, walk to tennis, walk to the market, and the like, and by having greater density in terms of, they still are predicated on the single-family house of a semi-detached house and whatnot, much more of it on apartments. But still, by increasing the density of a housing stock, you can have more in the way of open space, more in the way of amenities, and in that sense, it somewhat parallels the much more expansive kind of site planning that you would find in Numark Common.
In
yes.
King Farm? Because I walk there
well,
all the
new
time,
urban,
and
yeah,
I very rarely see anybody on the street.
well, I see what you mean. Whether
it's very walkable, and
yes.
I go there for lovely walks, but I
yes.
don't see any residents
other people
on the
walking.
street.
Well, not observing that sort of thing that keenly. I can't speak from personal experience. The idea of a new urbanism has been picked up in probably now thousands of communities across the country. So it's become a very substantial model. The places I have seen are such that if you have friends down the street, it makes sense that you can walk there. But oftentimes if you need to go to the store, if you need to do other things, there's still lots of other activities. Since these are somewhat isolated in a much broader suburban matrix, that you need the car. But I can't speak definitively as to how people's habits.
And I've walked in all seasons at various times of the day, and there are those beautiful wraparound porches, fully furnished. Rarely do you see anyone on the furniture on their porch.
It may be more of an idea than because I live in town in a row house, and it's a beautiful neighborhood with lots of trees and everything like that. I love to walk, but since our dog died, I don't walk in the neighborhood very much anymore. So.
To go back to the architecture, wasn't Seaside one of the early new urbanist communities?
Seaside was a prototype in the Panhandle of
Truman
Florida.
Show, and so that was modern architecture, and so they were doing the traditional community idea concept, but with very modern architecture.
Up to a point, yes.
Up to a point, and then we got Kentlands, which is very traditional in its architecture, and maybe part of it is the context, the difference between Florida and the mindset there, and Montgomery County being very much
part of the thing with Seaside as a kickoff development is they wanted to get a lot of publicity, and the way you do that is to get a lot of famous architects and do something that is really rather distinctive. But from the start, Anders Dwane's mantra has been, the communities we're emulating were largely done by builders. They were not done by great architects. And that this should be mainstreamed, and builders across the country are perfectly capable of doing this sort of thing, and King Farm would bear that out.
As a participating survivor in most of this recent past that you're talking about, I felt it necessary to truck over here tonight to make sure that history wasn't altogether lacquered over, particularly when it comes to the project that we so lovingly call Americana Center. Carl Freeman was a dear friend and a client. I did Americana Center. I did Americana Finmark. But Americana Center is where history is in danger of being a little bit fogged. Americana Center was built by Carl M. Freeman Associates, Inc., because the ballyhoo of federally funded urban renewal adopted by this city in 1962 was a magnet to Carl Freeman. Now, Carl Freeman was an apartment builder and developer all over the metropolitan area. He's a wonderful, talented man who did great things. But He was a rental apartment builder. Americana Center was built as a rental project. It failed as a rental project. Those people looking wistfully off the balcony down or the Rockville Pike were a figment of someone's imagination, because they did not come there to rent, and that's why it became a condominium, and that's why it has succeeded. And our dear friend Ed Bennett, of blessed late memory, the gentleman up front who was talking about having bought one of Ed's houses or lived in one on the perimeter, I was a survivor of that as well. I did the homeowner's documents for Ed Bennett and watched his bitter disappointment when the city chopped off Numark Esplanade and would let him build the center. There's some historic music. Anyway, I could not resist putting my 2 cents worth in, particularly about Americana Center.
Well, I'm glad that you did. The ad that I described with the two people is from 1976, 4 years after the conversion to condominiums. And that conversion took place very shortly after completion and grand opening. I mean, they weren't up for rent for very long. I don't think it even lasted a year. 1972 it opened. It was, construction started in 70, I believe, and it was, people were moving in 72, the summer of 72.
I was hoping to go back for a moment to the thrust of the original question, which is about marketing these communities. And unfortunately, I wanted to go back to maybe some of the more sober aspects of the post-war era. I'm fascinated that these communities directly bracket the whole civil rights era, from 1948, when Truman desegregated the military, to the 1990s with King Farm, when we, I think, throughout the community and with great passion and sincerity have embraced diversity and multiculturalism. But I wondered very specifically what the story of marketing and selling these communities was in racial terms, to be honest. I mean, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Twinbrook would have been integrated into the informal but nonetheless very effective redlining practiced by the FHA and VA system. I'd be interested to know if these communities trace any kind of a journey away from de facto but quite strict segregation. Was there any point at which the marketing began to embrace diversity? Was there any specific point at which lending became less channeled, less prejudiced? So I'm just interested. Please educate me.
No, Twinbrook was I don't think there were any covenants or whatever, but it was a white market, pure and simple. And the work I've done in Twinbrook is really about the initial development of a community in the 1940s and 50s, and not all the different things that have happened to it since. So I cannot, I'm not sure when it began to diversify racially in the 1970s, 1980s. I'm not sure. I have been poking around a little bit of this for housing in the Washington area more broadly. Gerhardt was, he was from Belgium, and as a European, he never understood why Americans were so prejudiced against blacks. So that some three of his later developments, which were all much smaller, were in Prince George's County, were all, quote, open housing. Two of them with semi-detached houses in Seat Pleasant, which was then actually a majority white community, but it had a recent post-war development of an enclave of semi-detached houses for blacks, and then he increased that substantially. And the other place was Glen Arden, which was a historically African-American community, and he did a fairly large, and some of the most expensive houses he ever designed for that, and then teamed up with, or at least was on the same track with the mayor of Glen Arden for building an apartment complex so that the children of people who, children who'd grown up in Glenarden could afford something in the community, all of which speaks to the fact that through the mid-'60s, it was still, irrespective of legislation, a pretty segregated situation. It's changing by the mid-'60s, and a number of Washington area home builders are saying they're opening up, they're taking some proactive steps. William Levitt in Bowie did not. He was very staunchly against the idea. But by the 1970s, the attitudes have changed. How much the demographics change, it depends very much where you go. And there's some places like Arlington County that are still very segregated, and others like Prince George's County, which are in the 70s. By the end of the 1970s, a whole demographic is on the way to one of the major sea changes in an American suburban community. But I don't know about Numark Common or
well, I think a lot of the policies took a while for people to accept and adapt to. I mean, it's really not until the 70s that you begin to see, people buying in, at least, and I don't have a lot of information to go on. Not done research in that area, but it took a while. Marketing, I don't really remember marketing to anything but what seems to be presumably a white readership. It all seems geared towards the white middle class until it's really until the 1980s that I begin to see ads that are show people from different ethnic backgrounds in newspaper ads. I don't remember seeing anything before that. I think it's the 80s really that you begin to see those kinds of that imagery appearing. But it took a long time.
The other thing I would raise is that most of when people are moving from the city to the suburbs, I said the messy, crowded, and heterogeneous city. I think that it's common throughout the United States that's what happened in the second half of the 20th century.
I just wanted to get back to the question or issue that you raised about Carl Freeman and his work, because I've done some research on him as well, and I think that the record shows that his work evolved over time, that he started in housing and then eventually got into garden apartments, but that by the late 50s, his interest really was in creating mixed-use communities. And he actually tried to get mixed-use communities in Cabin John, in Olney, in Gaithersburg. He had national land planner S.E. Sanders draw up the plans for these. He brought them out, shopped them around the community, and basically the public shot them down, and the planning department didn't want to see these a mixed-use community in the center of Cabin John. And that was a real sore point for him. He became a national speaker to advocate for mixed-use communities. Eventually had to go down to Fairfax to create the mixed-use community that he envisioned. So I think he was doing a lot of rental, and he also was one of the early pioneers in getting apartment complexes converted into condos, I think. Yep. So just wanted to add that.
Well, we've talked a little about architecture, and given the fact that this is the recent past series, I thought in this, I think we should start with the panelists' point of views, but I think that this is something that pretty much the community can talk about. Recent past is a very hard sell for preservation. Maybe also having to do with the fact that, people want to live in King Farm, and clearly, they've tried to make sort of modernist residential developments float, and they have a lot of problems. And this conception of sort of this memory of the colonial seems to be continually powerful, and it fits what we believe what historic buildings should be. And Americans somehow, we don't seem ready to move on. Like, this is a big problem. And I think that all of these complexes face that because they're all history of the recent past. And then as residential developments, which are relatively new, that also makes them sort of part of this hard sell for preservation. And I think that does anybody have a response to this problem?
Yes. I'm old enough to remember the first National Trust for Historic Preservation meeting I went to. I was a senior at the University of Pennsylvania. And for one of the tours, they were opening up the ancestral home of the Chu family in Germantown, which had been in their hands since it had been built in the third quarter of the 18th century. And I think it was the first time it had ever been open to the public that way. So I was keen on seeing it and coerced a couple of friends to do likewise. And we were about a quarter of the age of most people on the bus going out there, or that's what it seemed like. They're probably younger than I am now, but on the way through the district of Germantown, Philadelphia, there was this very interesting Victorian house of the 1850s, I think, that had been threatened and had been rescued by a local group. And they were trying to do something with it, which they ultimately succeeded in doing. And our tour guide was saying all this, and she said, and we have a time, and they would love to show us the house, and we've allocated time to do this. Who's interested? And the four of us in the back of a bus raised our hands. And I said, oh, good, we will. And I said something like it was wonderfully undemocratic to do that or whatever. The typical college quip, and as we were all getting out of a bus and so forth, you could all these septuagenarians or whatever in their fur coats and grousing about how this is the most hideous house in the world. This is the sort of thing that gives preservation a bad name. And what are they going to think? This is just such a waste of time, and all of that. And I've seen that happen with each successive period in American architecture since. So that I think, and having been involved in preservation efforts with, we'll say, post-World War II era work, that it's come a very long way in the last, in the last 20 years or so. And I remember even in Rockville, a very small little building that was a nursing building, as I recall, that Clotilde Woodard Smith had designed early on in her career. And I just recently ran across a thing about it in the correspondence of the editor of Architecture Forum, who showed it to one of his pictures to one of his staff members named Jane Jacobs, and she said, "Oh," he said, "Jane Jacobs is so excited as well as wants to write this up and so forth and so on," and it came down, and I don't think that would happen now. But this is a story that's repeating itself over and over again, and my students, who are still in their 20s by and large, don't find looking at the post-war era difficult at all, and a lot of them would love to have houses like those in Twinbrook or Hungerford. So what comes around comes around. It peaks, it goes down, it has a hits a real bottom part of it, and it starts to come up again. I guess that's the fickle finger of fashion.
Well, Richard, I certainly agree with you that there's a shadow of about 45 or 30 or 40 years where people really sort of kind of hate what came before, and things start getting historic right about at the end of that shadow. So there does seem to be a shadow. But specifically thinking about residential architecture, King Farm, Rockville was looking, as you told us, Rockville was looking for a traditional expression for like 5 or 6 story apartment buildings. It's bizarre. Really, if you understand what all of those pieces and parts are, the way they have assembled them on those buildings, it says history to people, and it says permanence to people. in kind of a reassuring way, and but it is none of those things. So it's a very interesting, and they chose that when they could have chosen anything. And there's something distinctively in American architecture, like residential architecture. Obviously, sort of high end. If you hire an architect, you get a really sort of modern design. But it seems sort of from mass market housing, we can't move beyond it. And I just think it's a really interesting problem.
Well, again, I think it depends where. You look at a lot of recent apartment houses in around downtown Washington, and a lot of them are really very interesting, and they're hardly, of a traditional image.
They're plastic shutters.
And I was recently revisited San Diego, which has one of the most thriving downtowns of any city today, and certainly for a city of its size, it's really quite remarkable. And there's a whole new, modernist vernacular and apartment house design that makes you feel like you're in the Netherlands or some other country where the standards of the public's standards for design are of a very high level. So I think there is a market for that sort of thing, but there is for traditional architecture too. And we have a very long tradition of borrowing from the past and doing what people think are very funny things with the past when they're done. And then I think it was Frank Lloyd Wright who said old buildings are like, or architecture's like, buildings are like ladies of the night. They begin to get respectable with age. And so there are lots of things that were heavily criticized at the time as being pseudish of one sort or another that the preservation community now generally embraces. So who's to tell the future of
Philip Kennicott, who's the architectural critic for the Washington Post and a Pulitzer Prize winner, I believe, calls it a default style. It's what people fall back on when they feel threatened, when they feel uncertain about the future. They fall back upon the past. It's comforting, it's reassuring, it's familiar, it's safe. People understand it and get it. And I'm wondering if maybe the schools, and we always dump on the schools, I know, but we need to do a better job educating people about, A, architecture, what it is, what it should look like, and B, about history, because we have to separate preservation from public taste. We have to take a step away from valuing things because we like them, and take a step take a step towards what matters and what's important and what's shaped our world. And getting people accustomed to that is a job of public education. Peerless has dedicated itself to that in many respects with this series and with other programming. But getting people to distance themselves, I guess, emotionally or ideologically, and to really appreciate something for what it is, as opposed to what they expect it to be or what they think it ought to be or what's sanctioned in a public kind of way, is, I think, a first step. At any rate, the recent past is the future of preservation. That's where it's going. That's what it's going to become. Most of the building stock that's out there is threatened, and that's what preservation is going to turn its eyes on in the next generation. So I guess they get ready.
Well, I would say, especially for a place like Montgomery County, where if you look at this, 60 years or so since World War II, virtually all of the county has been transformed, sometimes more than once, and there are a number of things in Rockville and Kensington and elsewhere that are older, but the post-war era is a major chunk of the heritage of this county, and I think it is beholden on planners and the preservation community to start looking at these sorts of things and assessing them from a detached perspective. But also, we cannot afford to replicate a Twinbrook for that market. have that much open space for an entering market. Essentially now it takes the form of apartments or condominiums, I guess I should say, or perhaps row houses. With one of Freeman's designs, Americana Glenmont, which I think is now on the chopping block, but this is we can't afford to do that again with the same quality of building materials and with the same amount of open space and amenities that it provides. I've written a little piece on Twinbrook that's in publication now, and but one of the things I compared it to early on was Veers Mill Village, and the people of Rockville seem to like Twinbrook, but a number of Montgomery County officials and business leaders called Veers Mill Village a slum, tried to stop it on the basis of corruption charges and all sorts of things. It was vilified. The houses were about $1,000 less than those in Twinbrook, and they looked more meager. But Veers Mill Village is still there and now provides entry-level housing for members of the Latino community, and some of Freeman's developments that I've seen in Prince George's County play a similar role, where once again those folks couldn't begin to afford what they can get with even a minimal post-World War II house in today's housing market in a place like Montgomery County. So I think from a historical perspective, but also from a contemporary perspective, that a lot of these need to be seen. Habitat shouldn't have to be chucked away after 2 generations. No other nation on earth does that. So a serious look at the post-war era's legacy from the standpoint of not only telling us about our past, but also the kind of environment we want, not just for those who can afford high-end real estate, but for many others as well, as imperative.
One thing with the recent past and residential communities like Rockville has is kind of the rise of architectural controls. Many of our communities like Numark Commons and King Farm, Brockshire, and others have homeowners associations that regulate themselves. And from that perspective, those communities are largely going to be preserved, and if they're modified, compatible from a compatible perspective. So, how does, from a preservation perspective, how do we address that in the future? Is there another layer of preservation that's added? Does it supplant the HOA? I think that's a question moving forward. Your point about the multifamily in King Farm is interesting. That was the first instance that we in the city really saw kind of the structured parking with the apartment units attached to it. So we hadn't seen that. There really wasn't a design aesthetics. It was somewhat innovative in terms of building construction, but the design is, they're kind of inventing the design, and I think they did kind of fall back on that comfort architecture with familiar images. Yes, it did kind of go along with the design of the rest of King Farm, but at the same time they didn't choose an elegant 1920s apartment building as the model. They did something much different.
If you're from New England, those apartments remind me, anyway, I'm not from New England, but I've spent a lot of time there, of the old 3-deckers in Milltowns. That's the first thing that popped into my mind, which I don't think is what they had on their minds.
Well, another issue to raise is, when we were looking at the pictures of Twinbrook, people and also Woodley Gardens, people have made a lot of changes to their houses. And so when you're dealing with planning, we're doing planned developments, you've got both the buildings and you've got the plan. And so when you're talking about sort of the ability of this development to continue to communicate its design intent, you kind of have these two things to look at. And I just thought it was an interesting, Richard, I was wondering if you had any interesting thoughts on the changes that people have made to their homes, and then whether or not they have changed sort of the atmosphere of the community. Is there a point where things will be too changed?
Very tough question. Because unlike, this is again mass market housing, but also housing that was in many cases designed with the idea that its occupants could add to it. And home improvement becomes a major deal in the post-war era. And so one could argue that change, at least up to a certain point, is part of, is an integral part of the nature of a place, which goes against some of the ideas that, the houses in the neighborhood that I live in have had very little change since they were built in the 1890s or 1900s or 1910s. And that's the way, it's a historic district, and that's the way it's going to, be kept. But a lot of post-war tracts are, I think, of a different sort, and call for some imagination in terms of, because a lot of the significance is in the siting and in the scale. So provisions that would prevent teardowns. And some, inflated thing going right up to the neighbor's line, but also something that made people aware of the heritage that they had, and who, in the case of Twinbrook, Joseph Gearhart was, and the kind of care he lavished on the design of his houses and what they looked like when they were new and all that sort of thing. So there's public information, but not necessarily precluding flexibility in terms of adding. Holland Hills, which is a modernist community that I mentioned near Mount Vernon, has that, and it's a neighborhood thing. With a design review committee and all of this sort of thing, and a lot of those houses have been added to in some significant ways. But there's nothing preventing certain things from happening. But by and large, it's been compatible. Sometimes it's been seamless, and a lot of this has to do with the interest of the people who buy in there to begin with. But also the kind of information that's disseminated to neighborhood residents. So there are all sorts of it's going to be a major challenge for preservation, because the nature of the beast has changed somewhat.
I was thinking back to your core question about why can't modernism get any traction? And it's a key question for the preservation of the recent past too. Why does this seeming suspicion, hostility exist? I think it would behoove those of us interested in preservation to be very candid about admitting how checkered the history of modernism has been. And that touches on this difference between architecture and planning. Modernist architecture can also be outstanding, and it will come back into fashion. It's just in its trough right now. Much of modernist planning was a debacle. If you're my age, you remember the municipal or government-supported housing developments on places like MLK Boulevard in Baltimore, or Lombard Street, or the south side of Chicago. Even areas that are architectural gems, like Americana Center, embody values that I don't think we'll go back to very soon. I once lived on Monroe Street and had to get to the metro. Americana Center does not welcome you. It turns its back on the city. It creates a dead streetscape around it. Within Americana, I'm sure it's lovely and creates a tight community feel, but I don't see that as something that we're going to embrace again as a value going forward. So I think some of what modernism struggles against is it's both the architectural taste, but it's also a lot of sort of Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of Cities, real hostility to other parts of the modernist package. It's a thought in any event.
Well, excellent question. My sympathies actually are with the architects and planners who have done what at the time were forward-looking projects, because they were dealing with the market and the taste of the public. Was it P.T. Barnum who said nobody ever went broke, underestimating the intelligence of the American public? Well, you could say the same thing about underestimating the taste of the American public. It's a real struggle, I think, historically, to get people to see what really works, what has enduring design harmony. And, for example, the apartment buildings in King Farm, they're not the worst examples of this kind, where a style of architecture that was pioneered for small-scale domestic buildings applied to huge structures where it's fundamentally absurd. But that's what appeals to people, because there's some emotional thing. And I will say, I happen to be on the board of directors at Numark Commons, and we struggle with the architectural control, because there are so many people who simply have no concept of what represents design integrity of the contemporary buildings. And they would like to have colonial style multi-panel doors with cutesy windows in them, because, well, maybe that's what they grew up with or something. They want to distinguish their house from others by putting on ticky-tacky. It's very sad, but, so in terms of historic preservation, it's a really tough thing. And there is no particular answer to it except to keep trying to explain why a certain design ethic has its own integrity, and if you undermine it, you wind up undermining the appearance of the neighborhood. That's a tough one.
But oftentimes, practical matters, and I think you just said it in your, summary sentence. Practical matters can take the upper hand, and if this is a matter of property values, that's something everybody can understand. If the attraction of a place is its specialness, to erode that, then is to lower the value of your property and maybe your neighbor's properties. From experience, I think of preservation as good planning, long-term planning that way, and usually there are arguments, practical ones, economic ones, one thing or another that people can understand and make sense, but you do, and sometimes you get lucky. After 7 years of trying to save a little shopping center in Cleveland Park called the Park and Shop, which happens to be the first of its kind in captivity anywhere in the world, built in 1930, and it was worth doing, and we were very disappointed by the developer who finally bought it, and wrangled with him and yelled and screamed at each other in the first couple of meetings, and then he came back with a big bouquet of flowers or something as a peace offering, and we started to get down to business, but still hired our own architect to keep his under control, and at the end of a process, which took about a year, he said, "Thank you. Everything you told me I couldn't do, you were right. Not just from the standpoint of my sensibilities, but what's going to work from a marketing standpoint, so forth and so on. He eventually sold it. I met with the people who bought it, and they agreed on a per square foot basis. It's one of the most lucrative properties in the city. But the developer turned out to be Douglas Jamal, who was not a major player or a known player at all at that point, and has been one of the major transforming developers using preservation for Woody's and any number of other buildings. He has a company warehouse now in the city, and he's looking at it from the standpoint of his sensibilities, but also from a bottom line. And he's gone from a fairly small potatoes business into a major company doing this, and it just underscores if you talk to people who do this and have a bottom line, always foremost in their minds, who get sold on this approach, it can be very effective in selling others.
All right. Well, I thought maybe sort of as we wrap up, if anybody else has anything they'd like to raise. Each of you have presented some very distinct communities, and one of the reasons, there are of course many, many reasons to preserve something, but one of them is to learn lessons from what we've built in the past. And I wonder if maybe you could briefly discuss sort of one thing that you think that the community you've represented will explain to the future.
I think looking at King Farm, it's a community that kind of harkens back to principles from a different time, and kind of riding that as a trend in and of itself. But I think this gentleman over here talked about some of the kind of planning trends that were, some of them maybe were not successful. Urban renewal, sometimes urban renewal was successful, times it was not. Here it was not particularly. The bunker-like urban mall downtown. Other communities did it, but it was not successful. So we have to kind of, I think King Farm represents kind of the best of things that happened in the past that were emblematic of their time, applied to current times. They're looking at a transit-oriented community where people could, if they chose, not use their car and focus more on public transportation and walking. And so, it's a model that we can look back to, and certainly passed as prologue in many regards with King
Farm. What's your yardstick for measuring assets versus liabilities? Urban renewal has come up, and I agree. If I saw the Rockville Mall under construction and took some photographs of it as a very odd thing to do to a town, and just blow it away, and as if it had been blitzed. On the other hand, there are all sorts of legacies of urban renewal which are really worth retaining in the long haul, mainly in residential development in various parts of the country. A walk-up tenement in New York was long seen as a liability, but not even Robert Moses could get rid of them all. And now, as they're rehabbed and made a lot more habitable, can provide very decent housing stock in that city. History is filled with situations where you had things that, for one reason, whether it's design, planning, or whatever, were seen as egregious or hardly beneficial at their time, and that's changed over time too. And I think it's very important to think of this process for those of us who are concerned about retaining portions of the past, that it's a fluid process. It changes over time, and as a historian, my concern is looking at the forces that shape something and why it was done. It's presumptive to think that a past generation were a batch of idiots and you're a lot smarter. If anything, the past should teach us some humility. So to find out the circumstances of things, but also to look at their potential for the future.
I think that Americana Center, specifically about Americana Center, it's out there. It's really visible. And at one time when it was first built, it was really prominent in its setting. The city's grown up around it now. It's not dwarfed, but it has to compete visually with other taller buildings in scale and height and so forth. But Americana Center, unlike the community where I live out in so-called North Potomac, which is, as Frank Lloyd Wright said, everywhere and nowhere, Americana Center has and derives its identity from its setting within the city of Rockville. And you were there, you were in your own community or neighborhood, if you will, but the city is all around you. And I think that's that sense of identity is something that I think is an important characteristic of Americana Center. And the history of the city is available to you. All you have to do is look out your window and you can tell a lot about Rockville from the architectural diversity of Rockville and the placement of the buildings. Its place in urban renewal history, which I think was not a total failure. I think there were things about it that were long-lasting and enduring and beneficial to the city. The vision of the developer, Carl Freeman, all the developers, Gerhardt, Bennett, and others, the Monroes, I think, these are things that we need to value in Rockville about our history and about the places where we live and work. So I hope that's what people will latch on to and take away with them.
I want to thank you all for so many good questions and for staying way past the time I thought we were going to be here. So it's been a treat. Thanks.
Again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I want to thank Elizabeth for moderating and also Terry, Richard, and Jim for speaking their minds about the recent past. If you'd like to learn more about it, you can visit our website at peerlessrockville.org. And Teresa Lachin has put a book out called Rockville's Recent Past. If you'd like to look at it, you're more than welcome to. It's on the back table. Thank you very much, and good night.